Welcome back to the Funeral Channel Network podcast. We're really glad you're here today because we are jumping into a brand new deep dive. And I was thinking about this earlier. Usually when we talk about like a medical diagnosis, right? There is this underlying expectation of absolute total precision.
Right, very analytical.
Yeah, it's almost like engineering. Like you break your arm, you go to the hospital, and the X-ray shows that jagged white line on the black background, and the doctor just points at it and basically says, well, there it is.
Yeah, it's entirely binary in that context. You can physically see the problem, which means, you can physically see the solution.
Exactly. It's either broken or it's not broken. It is a clean, visible, completely indisputable fact. And in a really strange way, I think that is deeply comforting to us.
Oh, absolutely. We love things to be visible.
We really do. We love our problems to be neatly categorized so we know, okay, here's the exact protocol for dealing with this. But then, you step into the world of navigating acute grief, you lose someone you love. And suddenly, that metaphorical X-ray machine it's completely shattered.
He doesn't exist anymore.
Right. You're suddenly looking out at this landscape of decision-making that is, honestly, it's incredibly murky. It is completely overwhelming. And I think the worst part for you, the person going through it, is that there is no simple diagnostic chart for how you are actually supposed to function when your world has just, stopped making sense.
Yeah, that really is the defining characteristic of acute grief, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not just an emotional state, it's a profound disorientation.
Yeah.
All the standard protocols of your daily life they vanish.
They totally vanish. Which actually brings us to our mission for today's deep dive. Because we're looking at a set of guidelines today that on its absolute surface seems incredibly mundane. I mean, almost administrative.
Very administrative, yeah.
Right. We've been reviewing some architectural concepts, for lack of a better term, put together by the Funeral Program site. And what they are essentially providing is a literal blueprint for putting together a beautiful funeral program template. It's a document literally called 3 Steps to a Beautiful Funeral Program Template. Now, for you listening right now, I know exactly what you might be thinking.
You're probably thinking, why are we spending an entire deep dive talking about, printing out a pamphlet?
Exactly. Why are we talking about brochures today?
It does sound a bit like we're going to read a software manual to you.
Yeah.
But what's really fascinating here is what happens when you look past those literal step-by-step instructions.
Okay, yes, let's unpack this, because our mission today is to uncover the profound psychological relief that is actually embedded in this kind of structural advice. We really want to explore how literal visual structure and design become essential, almost critical tools for navigating the overwhelming cognitive load of loss.
Yeah, because it's a massive load.
It is, and we are going to examine how taking a complex, emotionally fraught task and applying this rigid, simplifying framework to it allows families to actually focus on honoring their loved ones rather than just, drowning in an administrative nightmare.
Because if we're being perfectly honest, that is exactly what the immediate aftermath of a profound loss often becomes. It is an intense administrative nightmare, but it's layered directly over profound emotional trauma.
It's the worst possible combination.
Truly, you are suddenly asked to be an event planner, a financial negotiator, and a family mediator, and you are doing all of this while operating on 0 sleep and completely shattered emotions.
It's absurd when you really stop and think about it. And look, to you listening right now, we know that no one inherently wants to be in the position of needing this specific information. This isn't the kind of thing you casually research on a Tuesday afternoon while drinking your coffee, right?
Right. No one is hobby researching funeral templates.
No, exactly. But understanding the mechanics of how a streamlined, structured tribute works, understanding why visual boundaries matter in a time of crisis that can honestly be an absolute lifesaver when the inevitable happens, we're essentially trying to help you build a mental toolkit for the absolute hardest days of your life.
It's preemptive care, in a way.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. So I want to start by looking at this really fascinating paradox of time, stress, and the absolute terror of the blank page.
Oh, the blank page is a great place to start, because the framework we're analyzing from the Funeral Program site, it doesn't begin with font choices or margin sizes. It actually begins by acutely identifying the psychological state of the person sitting in front of that computer.
Yes. The very first concept established in the source is the absolute need for speed and simplicity. The guidelines explicitly point out that creating this tribute shouldn't be a drawn-out, complicated process. And that's specifically because of the incredibly short time frame families are working with. Usually, I mean, you have a matter of days, right?
Barely days sometimes.
Right. And I was thinking about the reality of that situation. Imagine opening a totally blank word processing document to design a multi-page program from scratch. It's basically like someone handing you a pile of freshly cut lumber, a heavy box of nails, and saying, hey, I need you to build a structurally sound house in exactly 3 days.
Yeah, it's an impossible ask. I
Yeah.
mean, even a
Yeah.
professional graphic designer would find that turnaround time stressful under normal conditions.
Right. But now imagine doing that while carrying a 100-pound backpack filled with absolute emotional distress. You probably haven't slept in 3 days. You're fielding nonstop phone calls from crying relatives. You're making massive, irreversible financial decisions with a funeral director. And now you have to figure out what margin widths, whether to use a serif or sans serif font, how to make an image background transparent.
It is the absolute perfect storm for decision fatigue, but amplified to an almost, well, an unbearable degree. If we connect this to the bigger picture of neurobiology.
Please do, yeah.
Yeah. Well, when you are grieving, your brain's executive functioning just plummets. It falls off a cliff. Executive function is the part of your brain responsible for planning, for focusing attention, remembering complex instructions, and juggling multiple tasks successfully.
Which is exactly what you need to design a booklet.
Exactly. But under extreme duress, your cognitive bandwidth becomes incredibly narrow.
So basically, your brain is rerouting all of its available power to simply dealing with the shock and the trauma of the loss. This system is crashing, essentially.
So that's a good analogy. You are in deep survival mode. Your amygdala is firing, your cortisol levels are likely through the roof, and the prefrontal cortex, which is the logical planning part of your brain, is suppressed. It's offline. So in that state, every tiny choice becomes a monumental hurdle.
Even the silly choices.
Especially the silly choices.
Mm-hmm.
Should this name be bolded? Should this picture be centered or, pushed off to the left a little bit? What font looks respectful for a 70-year-old man versus a 20-year-old woman?
Right.
Those aren't just minor design choices anymore. To a grieving brain, they feel like insurmountable mountains. You just can't process them.
So what does this all mean for the person actually sitting there staring at that blank screen?
It means they are burning precious, irreplaceable energy on the wrong things. The materials from the funeral program site explicitly argue that utilizing a pre-existing template eliminates the most difficult prompts of design. It identifies the saving of time and the reduction of acute stress as the primary advantages here. So we aren't just talking about a digital convenience, we are talking about a psychological safety net.
A psychological safety net. I think that phrasing is just crucial.
Yeah.
Because the goal isn't just to manufacture a pretty piece of paper to hand out at a door, right? The actual goal is to survive the week with your sanity intact.
Exactly. That is the true goal.
And the premise here is that by utilizing an established structure, you bypass the friction of creation. You eliminate the hardest parts of the layout, which implies that wrestling with page layout is actively stealing your focus away from mourning.
It is entirely parasitic. I mean, cognitive resources are finite. Every human only has so much decision-making fuel in the tank on any given day. If you spend 3 hours trying to figure out why a text box keeps jumping to the next page every time you insert a photograph.
Which always happens in Word.
Always. But if you spend 3 hours fighting that is 3 hours of emotional energy you have completely drained.
Energy that you desperately, desperately need for other things.
Precisely. That is energy that could have been spent reflecting on deep memories or comforting a sibling, writing a eulogy, or, honestly, simply sleeping, getting rest. The architecture of a template isn't just protecting your document's formatting. It is actively protecting your biological energy.
Okay, I love this angle. I really do. Because if eliminating that acute stress and protecting our energy is the ultimate goal, the very first action we take has to provide some immediate stability. We have to stop the bleeding, so to speak, of that mental energy, which logically leads us to the concept of establishing a foundation. Step 1 in the source material, choosing the tone of the event.
Yes. This is where the curation actually begins.
Right. So you go to a place like the funeral program site, and they offer this massive variety of structural styles. The materials describe options ranging from very traditional and highly spiritual aesthetics all the way to modern, clean, minimal designs. But I have to push back on this a little bit. I really want to challenge this idea.
Okay, go for it. What's the challenge?
Well, if I'm tasked with honoring someone I loved deeply, someone unique, someone with flaws and quirks and a whole rich life history, isn't relying on a pre-made template, something a stranger designed, kind of impersonal? Aren't we taking the easy way out when it comes to honoring an entire human life? I mean, it feels almost like buying a generic greeting card at the drugstore instead of writing a heartfelt letter.
It's a very common assumption, and to be honest, it's a completely understandable fear to have.
Right, you want it to be special.
You do. You want to honor this unique, irreplaceable human being. And the idea of pouring their rich life into a prepackaged quote-unquote template can feel, at first glance, a bit clinical or even dismissive. But I think that fundamentally misunderstands what the structure is actually meant to do.
How so? Like, how should we look at it?
We have to differentiate between the structure and the content. The source material states that the framework provides structure, balance, and a polished look without requiring any design experience. The key concept here is that the structure isn't the tribute itself.
Oh, I see. It's the vessel for the tribute.
Exactly. Think
Yeah.
of it like an art gallery. When you walk into a beautiful museum, the architecture of the building isn't the art. The blank white walls, the track lighting, the spacing between the exhibits, that is the structure. The art is the specific painting you hang on that wall.
That makes a lot of sense.
Right. So the framework suggests that you should select a design that reflects the personality and tone of the person you lost. That choice, deciding between a modern, minimalistic framework or a traditional, ornate one that isn't a cop-out at all, that is a profound curatorial choice. It is
Wow.
the very first act of deep personalization.
Oh, wow. That completely flips my perspective on it. I was thinking of it as conforming to someone else's idea of what a funeral should look like. But you're right, it's curation. For example, if I have to design a program for, say, an uncle who was this straight-talking, no-nonsense architect who just hated clutter,
Right.
choosing a modern and minimal foundation for him is an act of love. I am already honoring who he was before I even type his name on the keyboard.
Yes, exactly. And contrast that with choosing a highly traditional, perhaps very spiritual design for a grandmother who was deeply embedded in her church choir, who loved classical art and antique furniture. The visual language you choose sets the stage entirely. It subtly changes the entire atmosphere of the memorial service.
Because when the attendees walk into that church or that funeral home, the very first thing they're usually handed at the door is this program.
They are, and the moment they hold it, the visual tone communicates something deeply intuitive about the person they are there to remember. And that happens before they even open it, to read the obituary on the inside cover.
It's communicating on a totally subconscious level. Like, if the design is minimal, it breathes. The white space essentially tells the attendee, hey, we are focusing on the bare essentials of this person's impact. If it's traditional, it feels grounded, historical, rooted in a long legacy. You are essentially dictating the emotional temperature of the room just by choosing the foundation.
And you're accomplishing that massive emotional communication without having to be a graphic designer. You are making a high-level, emotionally intelligent decision, while the pre-existing structure handles the microscopic, mathematical decisions of exactly where the borderline should be drawn.
Which goes right back to saving that precious cognitive bandwidth we talked about earlier. Okay, so we've laid the foundation. To go back to my house building analogy, the walls are up, the roof is on, but a house with just walls is empty. It's just a shell. It needs to be filled with the actual life of the person. And that brings us to step 2 in the document, how we actually construct the narrative. And there's something here I found entirely fascinating: the psychological power of placeholders.
Oh, yes. This is where we transition from selecting an aesthetic to actually personalizing the physical artifact.
Right, so the standard elements have to go in. You need the loved one's name, the dates of birth and passing, the obituary, the order of service, and of course the photographs. But here's where it gets really interesting to me. The framework emphasizes that these designs utilize placeholders. It's explicitly designed so you can replace dummy text and dummy images without breaking the fragile layout of the page.
This raises a really important question, though. Why is the concept of a placeholder so vital in this specific context?
Well, because I don't think placeholders are just empty boxes. When we look at this through the lens of grief, I see placeholders as incredibly gentle prompts. Think about it from the user's perspective. If you are staring at that terrifying blank word processing document, you don't just have to format it. You have to actively remember what actually belongs in a funeral program.
Right, you have to generate the entire checklist from scratch.
Exactly. You might think, okay, we need his name at the top, we need the dates. But then your exhausted mind just goes totally blank. You start panicking. What else am I forgetting? Do I list the pallbearers here or on the back? Where does the poem go? Do I need to list the musical selections? It's terrifying because you feel like you are going to forget something crucial and ruin the whole thing.
That anxiety is so real.
It is, but a framework built with placeholders actively guides you. It acts almost like a companion. It says, hey, put a nice vertical photo here. Drop a favorite short quote right here. Oh, and here's a bulleted list where the order of service usually goes. It is literally holding your hand through the narrative arc of your loved one's life.
That is a brilliant observation. And it actually touches on something psychologists call prospective memory.
Perspective memory, what's that?
It's remembering to perform an intended action in the future, like remembering to buy milk on the way home, or remembering to include the officiant's name in a program. When you are traumatized, prospective memory is one of the very first things to fail. You forget appointments, you forget to eat, and you certainly forget the standard layout of a memorial service.
Wow, that makes so much sense.
Yeah, so the placeholder shifts the burden of memory away from the grieving individual. You no longer have to generate the checklist of requirements from your own exhausted brain. The design provides the checklist visually. You simply have to fulfill it.
It's like filling in a coloring book instead of having to draw the outlines yourself. You get to just focus on the colors.
Yes. And the guidance we're reviewing leans very heavily into one specific element of this fulfillment, which is the photographs.
Oh, absolutely. The source dedicates a lot of real estate to this idea. It suggests that photos are arguably the most important element during the stage because they are what actually tell the story of the life and create an immediate emotional connection for the people attending.
It does say that, but then it adds a detail that seems purely technical on the surface, but it actually carries an immense amount of psychological weight. It specifies that these templates include designated photo areas to ensure that images are, quote, properly aligned and displayed in a balanced way.
Okay, I really want to dig into this phrase. Why is properly aligned and displayed in a balanced way so crucial? I mean, obviously, I know it looks more professional, but if I'm crying in the third row of a church, do I really care if a photo is perfectly aligned by a millimeter? Is there something deeper happening there?
There absolutely is, but it requires us to look at the psychology of aesthetics, particularly how our brains process visual information when we are in a state of mourning. Grief, by its very nature, is chaotic.
It's totally chaotic.
It is entirely unpredictable. It makes the physical world feel like the gravity has been turned off. The sudden loss of a central figure in your life shatters your internal sense of order.
The world literally feels fundamentally unbalanced. It feels physically unsafe.
Yes. So imagine attending a memorial service. The environment is already highly charged with all this chaotic, heavy emotional energy. People are crying, whispering, unsure of what to say or where to stand. Now imagine being handed a program where the photographs are overlapping awkwardly. The text is jagged and unaligned, the images are stretched out of proportion, or a border is accidentally cutting off half of someone's face. What does that visually communicate to your brain in that moment?
Well, it communicates more chaos. It feels frantic. It feels rushed. Honestly, even if it wasn't the intention of the family at all, which of course it wasn't, it might even feel a bit careless or disrespectful.
Exactly. The visual disorder reinforces the emotional disorder. But conversely, when you hand those attendees a beautifully balanced, visually cohesive artifact, you are providing them with a subconscious sense of order.
Ah, I see.
Yeah, symmetry, proper alignment, and visual balance are deeply, inherently soothing to the human brain. Evolutionarily, we are hardwired to find comfort and safety in visual harmony. So by ensuring that the photos are mathematically aligned, the underlying design structure provides a small, tangible piece of dignity and peace in a moment that otherwise feels entirely out of control. It acts as a visual anchor for the attendee.
That is profound. It's like you're creating a quiet, safe little room on a piece of paper for people to just sit with their memories. The balanced photos aren't just there to look pretty, they're literally stabilizing the nervous system of the person looking at them. They allow the eye to rest, which in turn allows the mind to actually reflect on the person rather than being distracted by the jagged edges. I absolutely love that.
And it ensures that the emotional connection the guidelines talk about is actually achieved. If the layout is distracting, your brain is busy processing the error. You aren't looking at the warmth in the person's eyes in the photograph. You're looking at the weird way the text wraps around their chin. A good structural framework makes the design itself invisible, so the person being honored becomes fully visible.
The design becomes invisible, so the person becomes visible. That perfectly encapsulates why we're even doing this deep dive today. That is the magic trick of good design. But of course, just filling in the blanks on your computer screen is really only half the battle. You can have all the right quotes perfectly placed on your monitor, but if the final execution, the physical manifestation of this thing fails, the magic is instantly broken.
Which brings us to step 3, the crucial phase of execution and consistency.
Right. The guidelines are quite insistent here about finalizing and printing. They advise taking a moment to meticulously review the content for accuracy checking spelling, verifying dates, ensuring the formatting held up, and they assure the user that professional templates, like the ones from the funeral program site, are built with print-ready settings to guarantee the final product looks clean. And I was trying to think of how to explain why this matters so much, and I came up with an analogy. Have you ever ridden in a car with a really, truly blown-out suspension?
Unfortunately, yes. I had an old sedan in college that felt like riding in a shopping cart down a rocky hill. It is not a pleasant experience at all.
Right. Now, unless you are a trained mechanic, you probably didn't know exactly why the ride was so bad. You couldn't point underneath the car and identify the specific strut that was broken or the worn-out shock absorber. You didn't know the mechanical engineering of the failure, but you absolutely, viscerally felt every single bump. It rattled your teeth, it made your shoulders tense up.
Yeah, you spend the entire ride anticipating the next painful jolt. You just can't relax.
Yes, and that is exactly what inconsistent design is like to a reader. Bad margins, mismatched fonts, line spacing that jumps from single to double randomly from page to page. The person sitting in the pew at the funeral is probably not a professional typographer. They might not consciously look at the paper and think, the kerning on this Arial font is atrocious, and the left margin shifts by 1/4 of an inch on page 2. They don't have the vocabulary for it, but their brain feels the bumps. The reading experience is physically and psychologically uncomfortable.
That is a highly accurate comparison, and it leads directly into what the architectural guidelines highlight as a primary advantage in this third step: consistency. It is noted that these frameworks ensure every single page maintains the exact same margins, fonts, and spacing, creating a cohesive look. But then it makes a very important assertion. It says this level of consistency is difficult to achieve when designing manually.
Okay, I have to ask about that. Why is it so difficult manually? To a layperson, it seems like it should be the easiest thing in the world. You just highlight the text, pick a font, and hit copy and paste for the next page, right? Why do we need a special template just to keep margins straight?
You would think it would be that intuitive, but modern standard word processors are notoriously finicky when it comes to complex layouts.
They really are.
They are designed for writing letters and essays, not for multi-column, photo-heavy brochures. If you are doing this manually, you paste an image onto page 2, and suddenly, for absolutely no logical reason, all your text on page 3 jumps to page 4.
Oh my gosh, yes. Or you hit enter one too many times to create space, and the whole alignment of the document shifts entirely.
Exactly. When you design manually in a basic program, you are locked in a constant, frustrating battle with the software's automatic formatting rules.
You're fighting the machine while you're trying to grieve.
Precisely. But a proper template has that consistency hard-coded into its underlying architecture. The margins are locked into place. The text boxes have defined boundaries that won't spill over. The font styles are predefined as universal themes.
So it's basically shock absorbers for your document. It absorbs the bumps so the reader doesn't feel them.
Exactly. And this brings us to the most important why. Why does this polished, cohesive, bump-free look matter so deeply? If we connect this to the broader sociological picture of memorialization, a funeral program is quite often the only physical, tangible artifact that is created specifically to summarize a person's entire existence.
Wow, I hadn't thought of it in those absolute terms when you put it like that the stakes of this little folded piece of paper are actually incredibly high.
They are monumental. For many attendees, this is the only physical thing they will take away from the end of this person's life. This level of polish conveys deep, profound respect. It non-verbally says to everyone attending, this person mattered. We took the time, we ensured this was done beautifully, and we handled their memory with absolute care. It ensures that the final physical product feels intentional and high quality, completely, regardless of whether the grieving family member who clicked print has ever designed a single thing in their life.
And the guidelines specifically point out that because of these print-ready settings, you can print it on your home inkjet printer or take it to a professional local print shop and, quote, print with confidence, knowing that everything will appear as intended. That word confidence really jumps out at me. You do not want to be standing at a fluorescent-lit copy machine at a big box store an hour before the memorial service, sweating and crying because the boards are getting cut off and half the text is missing.
Confidence is the exact opposite of the acute stress and anxiety we discussed at the very beginning of this process. The structure has guided you from a state of total cognitive overwhelm to a state of execution and confidence. It's a remarkable transition.
It really is. So we've walked through building the foundation, we've filled it with a beautiful, balanced narrative using placeholders, and we've ensured the final execution is mathematically flawless and consistent. But this cohesive, polished aesthetic doesn't just apply to the 8-page program itself, does it? The materials reveal something really fascinating as we zoom out, looking at customization and what they call coordinated collections.
Yes, the scope broadens significantly here. The guidelines remind the user that while the structure is rigid, customization remains a vital part of the process. They suggest adding personal elements like favorite quotes, specific scriptures, or unique anecdotes so the final product truly reflects the unique life lived. But then, it introduces a concept that expands beyond the service itself.
Right, it talks about coordinated collections. The idea that these templates make it incredibly easy to coordinate other memorial items. We're talking about matching designs for things like prayer cards, bookmarks, and large portrait posters, creating what they describe as a unified presentation. So, my question to you is why?
Why does it matter?
Yeah, why does a unified presentation matter? I totally get why the main program needs to look dignified and nice. But why do families care about having matching bookmarks? Is it just about making it look like a coordinated high-end corporate event, or is there a deeper psychological mechanism at play here?
It's certainly not about corporate branding, though the visual mechanisms used are remarkably similar. If we connect this back to how human beings process loss over the long term, we have to recognize a harsh reality. The funeral itself is a singular, incredibly fleeting event. It happens over a span of a few hours on a random Tuesday, and then everyone goes home. It is gone. But the grief, the absence, and the profound need to remember that continues for years.
Decades even, for the rest of your life.
Right. So a unified presentation turns that single, fleeting 2-hour event into lasting, tangible touchstones. Think about the specific items listed in the document. Bookmarks and prayer cards. These are not disposable items. These are artifacts. People physically take them into their homes. A matching bookmark goes into a favorite novel that sits on a nightstand for 5 years. A prayer card gets tucked into a leather wallet or taped to a bathroom mirror.
It's so true. I literally have a laminated prayer card from my grandfather's funeral in the glove compartment of my car. I see it every single time I open it to look for my registration or a napkin.
Exactly. And the materials note that places like the funeral program site offer these coordinated collections to simplify the process of creating these long-term artifacts. By utilizing the exact same visual language across all these items, the same modern minimalist aesthetic, the same specific shade of navy blue, the same elegant fonts you used for the program The Family is creating a recognizable, dignified visual identity for their loved one's final tribute. When you open your glove box and see that card 3 years later, the visual consistency immediately bypasses your conscious brain and transports you right back to the dignity, the love, and the respect of that service.
It creates an emotional anchor. It elevates the card. It's not just a random piece of paper with a Poe on it. It officially belongs to a specific, highly honored moment in time. And the guidelines mention that, quote, even with a template, you have the flexibility to add personal touches. Which brings up what I think is a truly fascinating paradox about this entire concept of structured templates.
What do you mean? The paradox of customization.
Yes. Think about it. We talked earlier about how templates give you a rigid, unyielding structure. You can't just move everything willy-nilly without breaking it. The margins are locked, the boxes are set. But it seems to me that it is exactly that rigid structure that actually enables deep, meaningful customization.
Explain how you see that working in practice.
Well, if I am terrified about the margins getting messed up, or if I'm spending an hour sweating over trying to make a text box transparent over a photo, I am fundamentally not using my brain power to think about my loved one. I'm thinking about software. But because the template locks the margins and the layout down, my mental energy is completely liberated. I don't have to worry about the how. I now have the emotional capacity and the time to go dig through my dad's old books to find the absolute perfect quote he had underlined. Or I have the quiet time to really think deeply about which specific poem best captures his spirit. The rigid constraints of the template are what actually allow me the freedom to focus on the deeply personal, intimate details.
That is a profound insight, and it aligns perfectly with the underlying promise of these guidelines. that a template allows you to create something meaningful with ease. The ease isn't just about saving 30 minutes of typing. It's about liberating your cognitive and emotional resources so you can apply them to the content that actually matters to the human heart. The visual structure acts as a container for your grief and your love.
A container for your grief.
Yes. Without a container, water just spills out everywhere. It becomes a mess. It becomes overwhelming and unmanageable. But with a strong, well-designed container, you can carefully and deliberately place the most precious items inside. You can carry it.
A container for your grief and your love. That is incredibly powerful. And honestly, it really brings us full circle on what this document, what these guidelines from the funeral program site are actually offering to people. It's not just selling a digital file or a set of printing instructions. When you really analyze it, it's offering a methodology for coping.
It is entirely a coping mechanism. It is offering a structured, safe pathway through one of the most disorienting and chaotic experiences a human being can face.
So if we look back to summarize the journey we've taken through this topic today on the absolute surface, if you just skim the text, it boils down to three simple, almost mechanical actions. Choose a foundation, add your personal content to the placeholders, and review it so it prints cleanly.
That is the purely functional, operational summary, yes.
But as we've uncovered in our deep dive today, these steps represent something vastly deeper than graphic design. They represent a profound psychological mechanism for managing trauma. They save precious time when the clock is ticking loudly and unforgivingly. They drastically reduce acute stress by eliminating decision fatigue at a neurobiological level. They provide much-needed visual balance and symmetry in a moment of emotional chaos. And ultimately, they allow devastated families to create a respectful, lasting, cohesive tribute without the crushing, paralyzing burden of starting from a blank page.
It summarizes it perfectly. By removing the technical complexity of creation, the family is allowed to produce a tribute that feels thoughtful, polished, and complete. And in doing so, it allows the family to regain a small but vital sense of control and agency during a week where they feel they have lost control of everything else. Successfully completing this beautiful artifact to honor the person they lost is an act of empowerment.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive today. But before we go, I want to leave you, our listener, with a lingering question to ponder as you go about the rest of your week. The guidelines we explored state that using a template saves time and reduces stress so you can, quote, focus on what truly matters. And we've talked a lot about what that means. But I want to propose a slight shift in perspective.
Let's hear.
What if the very act of filling in those template placeholders isn't just some administrative hurdle you have to clear before the real morning begins at the church? Think about those quiet late-night moments sitting alone at a computer. The moments spent slowly agonizing over choosing between two different photos of a smiling face. The moments spent verifying a favorite scripture, reading it over and over to make sure it fits perfectly into the layout. What if, guided by the gentle, invisible constraints of that design, the actual physical act of building this program, curating the life of the person you loved into this beautiful container, becomes the family's very first vital step in the active grieving process?
A beautiful, poignant thought. The work itself, the curation, becomes the very first act of letting them go.
Exactly. The design is the start of the healing. Until next time, take care of yourselves and take care of each other.